Thank you so much for coming back to another episode of Parenting is Easy, Said No One Ever. We have a really awesome episode for you today. I had an amazing talk today with Gayle Weill, who is specifically dealing with adoption cases, which is something that, while I may not have any familiarity with when it comes to how to deal with it within the therapeutic setting, I think there are so many topics within that topic of adoption that I think are really important and we can all benefit from when it comes to parenting, and not just people that are dealing with adoption, but I think us as parents, we can really learn from. And we touch on two other really, really important topics when it comes to hypnosis and how that's something that could be of benefit within the therapeutic process, within parenting, within ourselves, and also shaming behaviors and shaming how we deal with shame, whether it's among siblings themselves, within the family dynamics, us as parents. Hopefully this is something that you can learn as much from as I did. I hope you enjoy this episode. So, Gayle, I wanted to talk to you about the concept of adoption, and when it comes to what parents should be knowing that, for the most part, at least from what you've seen, parents don't know. So let's start there first. Like, what are the most basic things that parents should be knowing before they even go down the route regarding adoption?
I think one of the biggest things to know is that the child will have some sort of, identity exploration, wanting to know where they come from. And, it's, nowadays it's become more open. Like, parents are more, they're given the advice by professionals to talk about it, to let the child know that they were adopted. But that wasn't always the case, From a lot of adoptions were closed, and it wasn't talked about. Questions were very much, not addressed. And with that knowledge that, one's adopted, they want to be able to explore their identity, and parents shouldn't take that as, they shouldn't take it personally. I think that sometimes feelings come up where, like, well, what about us? We raised you, but it doesn't mean that your child doesn't love you. It doesn't mean that, your attachment is in any way, shape, or form strong. It's just something that the children will want to explore. And to have open-ended discussions about that is important.
So in your time working specifically in this area, I'm curious, have there been certain things that have been either an eye-opener to you or that you learned new regarding the concept of adoption, regarding, I get to say, little pearls of wisdom when it comes to the adoption world and the parenting in the adoption world?
Yeah, I would say I have learned quite a lot. One thing is for sure, to seek support from a professional that has experience specifically in adoption is very important if you're finding that you do want to seek out therapy, because there's a lot of little nuances involved with adoption. What I've found in the field that sometimes, with well-intentioned professionals, they may, make recommendations, for example, that aren't necessarily evidence-based with adoption competency. So it's really important that you're seeking professional help, that you're working with somebody that has specific experience with adoption. So that recommendation.
What is that that adoption competency? Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, adoption competency is simply, I'm trying to figure out a way to say this succinctly. It is knowing all the nuances and the clinical terminology and best practices of working with either people who are adopted, adoptive parents, or birth parents.
Got it. Okay. So, obviously having the right team around you and the right support group is obviously something that is very important when it comes to this concept. Do things change regarding where to look for the help regarding the age of the child or the age of the parents? And are there certain things that are a foregone conclusion that these are the most important things, no matter where you're holding in the adoption stages, no matter how old you are as parents, maybe, whether our other kids at home or not, these are the things that are a for sure foregone way of needing to make sure you take care of beforehand, or maybe there are certain things that are really depending on what the situation is that you would specifically talk about or have parents want to think about in the adoption stages?
Sure. I would say it's always good for whatever particular circumstance you're looking for with assistance on different matters, whether that be adoption or whatever else. I would say it's important to seek a professional that's aligned in that particular niche. So I think, to illustrate this with an example, um, a parent is, wanting support around different behavioral difficulties that the child is experiencing. You may have a very well-intentioned therapist who suggests, for positive reinforcement, or maybe they would request an evaluation for ADHD. But those are not necessarily things that somebody with the adoption competency specialty would recommend. So an adoption competent professional would instead, suggest that, they would bring to the family's awareness the issues that come up and how best to respond to those behaviors rather than just jumping to evaluation and ignoring the the nuances of where it's coming from, the behavior. I think behavior is communication. So, sticker sharks, they have their place, but a lot of times there's a feeling behind the behavior. And somebody with knowledge and experience who's very much aware of those nuances can maybe better assist in that particular circumstance.
Got it. That makes sense. So, when you talk about the concept of adoption therapy, I'm curious if there are certain questions that you would recommend parents seek when they're looking for that type of therapist to be a part of this bigger picture and this support team. Are there certain things that parents should be looking for, and what type of questions should they be asking a therapist?
Well, it's really important for parents to ask, like, have you worked with people who were adopted? Have you worked with adoptive parents? Have you worked with birth parents? And if you have, how often are you working with those people? And what is your particular training in regards to working with those people? And they can also ask, about different recommendations. A professional may say, well, let's schedule a session and then we can really get into it. But for a parent to ask, what would your recommendation be in regards to answering certain questions that my child has? And for what the therapist says and if it aligns. I think also for different terminology that the therapist uses. So if the therapist is saying, like about the birth parent, for example, their real mom or their real dad, that's icky, because that's the birth parent. The real parent, in adoption circles, that's the person that raises the child. There's no real, there's no, you want to look out for terminology as well.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Besides for a therapist, what other people within a team would you recommend people have on their side when it comes to starting this process?
Yeah, I think a good family support system can be incredibly helpful. I think it, the old expression, it takes a village to help raise a child. I think that's true. I think you can always use, whether it be with adopted children or biological children, you could always use that additional support. And even if one is adopting from birth, then, it still brings about challenges. But like I said, there's always going to be that identity exploration. And also, there's a feeling of loss too. And again, there's no guilt or shame here. Like, this is just a natural thing that comes up with adoption.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's something that, no matter what, I guess you could say, stages you are in the adoption stages, there's going to be things you're going to run into that are going to be hiccups, or they're going to be roadblocks in a certain way. And to be prepared for that and understand that there are things that are inevitable when it comes to this process, and there are things that, there's a long road ahead, and knowing that this is a lifelong endeavor and not just something that's like a one-time event of the next couple of months to figure this all out. It's something that I think is important. Are there certain differences that parents should be aware of if, let's say, this is their first time doing this and they already have kids at home, as opposed to let's call them second time adopting parents, and how they would go about the process?
So it was, there's a difference, I would say, between adopting through foster and then, going through a private agency. So I think that parents need to consider, how they want to go about that. I think that's the first thing. With going through foster care, that of course, brings about its own challenges, between the permanency with the biological parents and, whether the child may reunify with their biological parents is, in question until a certain point. The process on the flip side could be a little bit more challenging with private agencies, but certainly it could be smoother in the sense that that the child is able to be adopted.
Got it. Okay.
And different things to take into consideration where the child is being adopted from.
Understood. Now, does it also make a difference where if the child is coming from, let's say, within continental United States, as opposed to if they're coming from overseas?
Mm-hmm. I would say that they're definitely, like, adopting overseas. That brings about its own challenges, certainly. In terms of difference, you mean with the ease of adopting? Is that what you mean?
Well, it's specifically regarding the ease and the whole process. Are things different in the process? And maybe there are certain things that parents should look out for if they're adopting from overseas. And then also just regarding the home and bringing in a child into the home that is coming from overseas, and just being from a different world and a different culture.
Yeah, I would say a lot of times when you're adopting overseas, often that means that the culture is different. You look very visibly different from your child. And so then it's, there's not a question of, whether the child, whether revealing the adoption to the child is in question. It's just obvious from their parents. So that certainly brings about a whole different set of things to think about, because there's more questions right off the bat, right? Like the child is gonna, they're going to see that they look different from their parents, and maybe people outside of the home will comment on it. And how do you respond to that? And also the celebration of the child's culture and where they come from. That's also incredibly important too. There's a lot of things to think about in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. Can you talk a little bit about how to talk to kids that you have, maybe biological kids, how you would talk to them about what's happening? And obviously, I understand it makes a big difference if they're little kids or opposed to if they're, tweens or young adults. I'm curious, like, regarding how to talk to them about this thing that is happening, and how for them to be able to be accepting of it, but yet also loving towards this new child that's coming to their lives and their brother, sister.
Yeah, I would say, like you said, it really depends on the age of the child, how you're going to talk with the child, right? I think the best thing is to be open and empathetic and appropriate in language. So let's say, I think using your example, you have a biological child and you're going to be adopting a new child. Is that what you mean in regards to how to talk with the child about it? Yeah.
Correct.
I think that you can say, we're gonna have a new brother or sister in our family, and how do you feel about that? And let the child respond. Maybe if the child is a little bit more verbal and has some questions about it, you can answer those questions as easy to understand and compassionate as possible. And why compassionate? Because maybe there's an undertone of feeling like, oh, things are going to be different. Like, what does that mean for your love of me, right? Because that sometimes come up. This kids are very egocentric by just, their developmental nature, and everything is in their little world all about them. So I think it's really important for a parent to, let their child know that, I am never gonna lose my love for you. I'm gonna love this new baby, and luckily, mommy or daddy has enough love in their heart for you and your new sibling. I think it's important to emphasize that.
Yeah, and to really give a platform for them to feel comfortable to talking about certain things. I think is going to be a very important part to that.
You don't want to shut down their questions, because then they're learning that it's not safe to talk to mom or dad. You want to be able to have an open-ended discussion with them and create a space where they feel comfortable talking about what comes up for them.
Sure, which I want to get to that topic of when we do certain things at home, and how that could really come into play regarding making sure that we're parenting in a way that it's very aware without any shame towards behaviors towards kids. But before we get to those things, I just want to follow up just a few more things over here on the adoption aspect of things. I'm curious to hear from you just regarding when you have blended families. Families where each spouse is coming with kids from a previous relationship, and they're coming in and having that type of talk with the kids regarding, hey, there are other kids coming into our family, and we're going to be together. I'm curious if for parents and how they would deliver that and talk to the kids. Is that something you would recommend both of the spouses do together, with all the kids together, do it each individually? And I think there are so many different variables to think about when you're bringing newness into a family that's so part of whatever their routine is. I'm curious if things change regarding how you would talk regarding a blended family, or how a parent would be talking regarding adopting a child.
Yeah. In the case where two parents are getting married, and then the family is going to merge. Is that what we're talking about? I just want to make sure.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would say the first thing is to talk with the children individually, because they're normal, right? They're used to having that one parent, and things are going to change drastically. So before the conversation takes place with both parents together, I think you first want to have a conversation, by yourself with the child or children, and let them know what's going to come up, and then give them the space to how they feel, ask any questions. It's good to have a conversation all together with both parents. Introductory conversation with the primary parent, who the child knows and is used to. I think that's a really important first start.
And when it comes to, let's say you have, like we were saying before, you have kids that are a little bit older. They're like young adolescents, and parents or parent has decided on adopting a child. At what point within the adoption stages should a parent be talking to a child?
I think when they are decided on it, or even brainstorming with them, like the parent couldn't have a conversation with the child time when everybody's feeling calm and there's some time to talk about things, like a family meeting type of setting. The parent could say, hey, I've been thinking about it. I've been really wanting to add to our family. I was thinking maybe I'm thinking of adopting a child, and the parent can explain what that means. It means that this is not this is a child that is coming from a different family setting, and what do you think about that? How does that make you feel regarding somebody else joining our family? In a different way, maybe, from some of your friends in school.
Yeah. I think, just, what we talk about here on the podcast is ABC the moment, always be curious with it and stay questioning. And I think that goes really far, especially making that type of culture within the family dynamics within the home is so important. And I think obviously one of the things that we're just saying before is whatever question they're asking is a good question. And if they're being curious about something and they're comfortable to talk to you about something, that really says a lot about where their mind is and where their comfort level is with you as well.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I know you and I talked about, as we were trying to come up with the time for us to talk about these important topics, is the concept of shaming behaviors within the family. So I'm curious just to hear from you when we talk about kids doing things that they have the best intentions, or sometimes even not the best intentions, and they do certain things that I guess is apropos for their age. I'm curious when it comes to the concept of shaming the behavior and how detrimental that could be towards the relationship, towards their own self-esteem, and towards the family dynamics. Can you talk a little bit about what shaming towards a behavior that a child does, with the impact that can have on the child and on the family dynamics?
Yeah, I think you see it a lot. A child is maybe they're hungry, or they're a little bit more tired than they usually are, and then they purposely throw something across the room, and it's not a ball. It's maybe like an iPad. It's fragile. It's really bright, right? So I think it's really hard. The parent is only human too, and the parent has to really keep their anxiety in check when something like that happens. And I think to your question, the detriment it can have, I mean, a lot of issues that can crop up is the child really feeling misunderstood and unsupported by their parent. I think that can come up. And I think what does the child really need in the moment is something to think about. Like it's totally appropriate to tell the child, please don't throw that, right? But if the child has some external need, like they need food, they need food, or they're just upset about something that happened at school, or whatever the case may be, they need their feelings to be validated before any kind of scolding. Otherwise, they're really, I think, going to internalize the scold and feel badly about themselves and misunderstood by their parents. And then they're not feeling, it snowballs, right? Like then they're not feeling comfortable being completely open with their parents because their parent doesn't get them, things to take into consideration.
When it comes to seeing kids that might be shaming their siblings, I'm curious, how can parents approach that regarding the behaviors that they're doing? Yes, it may not be what you like or what is even proper in this specific situation or even ever, but I think sometimes the concept of how kids talk to each other regarding their own behaviors can sometimes be a challenge at home for parents. And I'm curious how you would talk about that to parents, how they can help the situation at home.
First thing is that when we see our children scolding each other or name calling or some behavior we don't like, our anxiety to get the best of us. I think the first step for a parent is just to check in with themselves. Are they feeling their heart start to race and they need to intervene immediately? Are they feeling the sense of urgency? Because if so, that's the anxiety, tricking them into thinking they have to act right away. I think first is to take a breath, slow down, and check in with themselves about how best to respond. And then the question becomes how best to respond, right? Say, for example, you have one child saying, I'll use an example from my own household, okay? You have one child saying, don't do that, you're a bad girl, I think the parent could then intervene and say, she's just learning, she's, no one's bad here. We just need to learn not to do that, I think the parent can jump in a kind way and teach. as opposed to scolding the child who's scolding the sibling.
And what happens when you have a situation, though, where, let's say, parents are not on the same page regarding how things are happening at home or how certain behaviors, how would you bring that up within, let's say, the therapeutic room, and what would be the treatment regarding how to deal with that within the family dynamics, which can really be severed based on the huge difference or different points of view that each of the parents have?
Yeah, when parents aren't on the same page with one another, that becomes very confusing and confusing for the children and aggravating for the parents. Right? Parent loves the kids and wants what's best for them, right? That's one thing that they can agree on, even if they're disagreeing on discipline practices. The first step is letting them know that we have to find some commonality here in how we're going to respond consistently so that the children are not confused. And so that they don't feel any extra stress. You know, when mom and dad are on the same page, that ultimately is really, really important for kids, you know? So that's the first step. And just letting the parents know we got to find some common ground. We got to understand where you both are coming from and what is best practices in terms of how to respond. And can you both agree to that? You both agree to some rules, you know, and how you're going to respond.
So you're saying, like,
yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, if you can't agree, can you at least respect that the other parent is an adult who has the child's best interest in heart? I mean, what you do is what you do, and what he or she does is what they do.
So basically making sure that each parent is putting aside their own ego to find that common ground that they have, and we're both in it for the right reasons. And I think that's the important part over here. So, you know, when it comes to, there's obviously so much more we could talk about regarding these two big topics that we talked about, but something I just wanted to just pick your brain on a little bit, because it's not something we've talked about here on the podcast, but I think something that could be of benefit just based on, I know, your expertise when it comes to hypnosis. And I'm curious how that is something that could be of benefit. Let's talk about specifically to parenting and how we go about dealing with things at home. And just give us a little bit of a background, what hypnosis is, what hypnotherapy is, and how people can find the right therapist that can really, they can engage with when it comes to this specific topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Hypnosis, it's often thought of as silly, like I'm going to, as a hypnotist, make you quack like a duck, or there's going to be some kind of mind control involved. And there's like this woo factor, right? So hypnosis makes people raise their eyebrows. But the reality is, hypnosis, that's simply Hollywood, what I just mentioned. You know, certainly there is comedy hypnosis. That's definitely a thing. But there's no mind control. We actually hypnotize on a regular basis, every single person, by the way, we don't even realize it. Because hypnosis simply is just the ability to speak directly to one's subconscious mind. So that means that anytime we're distracted, even like we're daydreaming, it's just like our hearing is not turned off. We still hear around us. So we're not consciously hearing it, we're not consciously hearing it, but because our hearing is so on, it's going directly into the subconscious mind. So I can best illustrate this with an example. Like, you know, you're watching a show and a commercial comes on and you're zoning out. Well, whatever's going on in that commercial, you're still hearing it. We're like, yeah, you're not paying attention to it. Maybe you're doing something else. But something about the commercial captures your attention, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, he's saying that. What's that about? You know? Because again, like, it's just the conscious mind being distracted enough to talk to the subconscious mind. So what does that look like in practice? Like if like I'm saying that, you know, a person is hypnotized regularly on a daily basis and not even realizing it, what does a hypnotherapist then do? What's the difference? The hypnotherapist is simply helping a person to either relax or distract their conscious mind. By doing that, then we can talk directly to the subconscious mind and work on specific issues that the conscious mind is having difficulty addressing. Because sometimes the subconscious, it holds a lot of information that, of course, in the subconscious, we're not even consciously aware of it. Now, that's a lot of jargon. I want to try my very best to break it down a little bit more. So another example of just being hypnotized on a daily basis. You're driving a car, you're going somewhere, it's a new route, you put it into the GPS, and you're really very vigilant about listening to the GPS and making the turns when it says to, and then you find yourself at your location, right? You do this stuff 100 times. By then, you're able to kind of just drive automatically. Those directions are stored in the subconscious. You're not even thinking about it. You end up at your location. You're like, whoa, I'm here already? Like, how did that happen? Like, I was just daydreaming the whole time. When you're in that state of mind, getting to your location and not even thinking about it, that itself was a state of hypnosis. You are a lot more suggestible, in other words, than you would have been otherwise during that state. Makes sense regarding what hypnosis actually is.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Now I'm curious how we can bring it into, like, what should a person be looking for or asking when it comes to how hypnotherapy can be beneficial to them? I understand the difference between the conscious mind or the unconscious mind and just getting into like a specific place. So, and it sounds like it's a really good tool when it comes to an added part of therapy, but not being a therapeutic, intervention on its own in a certain way. So that's what I'm sort of understanding.
Component, certainly. The way I see it, and I just describe this by talking a little bit about what cognitive behavioral therapy is, because that's such a common modality in therapy sessions, right? So, your thoughts, feelings, behaviors, they're all interconnected. That's CBT in a nutshell. But what happens if our thoughts, we know logically something, but we cannot, for whatever reason, line up our feelings with that logic. So it's like somebody rear-ended you, heaven forbid. Somebody rear-ended your car. Logically, that it's not like they did it purposely. In most situations, people aren't rear-ending you just for fun, I would say 99.9% of the time. You know that logically, but immediately your instinct is to be like, why did that person do that? Like, here I am, running late for an appointment. You're really angry. You can't tame down that initial, like, oh my God, that just happened. Just to be coming from a place of just being really angry, because now you got to get your insurance out. You've got to deal with somebody with this incident, and it brings a whole lot of other factors to worry about. But is that anger, is that coming from a place of only that, or is it coming from a place of how maybe let's bring parenting in it, how you observe your own parents interacting when something happens that they didn't want to happen? So, like, if you grew up in a household, let's say, where parents were generally pretty calm, so they didn't go their way and somebody rear-ended them, they get out of the car calmly. They say, okay, well, let's get our insurance out. Let's call the police. Like, they were very calm about it, okay? Versus parents that, like, would scream at the top of their lungs when any little thing happens. Like, you may subconsciously, because you observe that, you may subconsciously take on the latter, where you're going to yell, you're going to start cursing, whatever. Even if you know something logically, behaviors and feelings, they don't line up. And that's, I think, where hypnosis could be helpful. The first step is to discuss that. Where do you think that kind of, like, if you're wanting a change in that kind of behavior, where do you think that's coming from? Like, do you think that's just coming from your own anxiety with having to deal with something annoying that happened that you didn't expect? Or is that coming from, is it coming from that? Or is it also coming from observed behavior, and, like, that is how you're supposed to respond? Like, that your subconscious is thinking is how somebody just responds in that kind of situation. And in that case, we can then target the hypnosis to the subconscious a different message that I have to respond.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when it comes to yeah, for sure. And I think when you're narrowing in and you're zeroing into those specific behaviors, I think that could go really far for, really discovering the self and how we become reactive in certain situations, which again goes back to that question of where does it come into regarding parenting? Well, you just answered the question of the way we're going to react in certain situations. Where is that coming from? How is that connected to me? Which, I guess as a therapist, one of the things that come to mind is that what's that inner child like right now? And how has he been dealing with things in a certain way? And how is that something that we can process with and through him? And we're going to have an opportunity to talk to someone that's works a lot with inner child work in a future interview here. But the concept of being able to go inside and going in and making that U-turn so that you're going inside to saying, okay, why is this happening? Why am I feeling this way? And why am I acting this way? Why am I reacting this way? I think that's really where hypnosis is something that can be very, very helpful. And that's, I think something we can all use, whether it's for parenting, whether it's for our relationships, whether it's for work, or honestly, whether it's for ourselves, just to see how we become reactive to certain situations. I think hypnosis could be something that could be very beneficial, but each to their own for how they go about finding it and working with it and making it a part of their own treatment plan.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, important for situations that maybe are objectively normal. If you find yourself having, as a parent, an exaggerated response to a developmentally appropriate behavior, that's also, I think, a clue to think about it. What's going up subconsciously?
What would be an example? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I'll use an example from my own life. I have been particularly triggered when my children are, it's bedtime. I leave the room and they start crying. That's something that I know is developmentally appropriate for young children. I have toddlers. And I know that that's developmentally appropriate. You have to go to sleep. Sometimes you don't want to. X, Y, and Z reasons. There's a variety of reasons why kids, don't want to go to bed. Fear of missing out and all of that. But I find that even though I know that, I get a little bit triggered. And what I've discovered through my own my work on myself is that memories of not particularly enjoying going to bed when I was younger. I remember specifically that sometimes I would be up in the morning and waiting, for my parents to come and get me to start my day when I was really, really little, I mean to say. And I still remember that. And it made me feel a little bit better. When I can zero in on that and recognize that that's where this trigger is coming from, I can then put it into perspective, and I consider the fact that, okay, it's not the same type of situation, and it really is developmentally appropriate. I think things as they actually are, a little bit more clearly.
It makes a lot of sense. I think that's a very good example. Very, very relatable. I appreciate that. So, there's, I think, a lot more things on this topic and on the two other previous topics that we've been talking about today that we could really talk about for a really long time. And I still have a few questions over here that I would love to try to get to. But as we are running out of time over here, I'm curious on these specific these three topics: on adoption, on shaming, and on hypnosis. Are there certain points that maybe we haven't talked about that you feel is really beneficial and parents can gain from knowing something that we haven't yet talked about here on this interview?
One thing to zero in on is that biological children, adopted children, this is going to come up. It's important to just be aware of I just want to zero in on the differences that could potentially come up with adoption, just to put emphasis on the fact that, as parents, we love our kids. We want to do right by them. We want to do the right thing. And when something happens, sometimes we can take things personally, as I said earlier. But I think it's important to, like you said earlier, Kananya, our egos aside, and recognize where it's actually coming from. And when you can do that, you can respond in a much healthier way. I think putting emphasis on that point is really important.
Yeah, that's great. And 100% agree. And I think that's something that we have to do constantly, every day, and probably even multiple times a day, to stay in check with it and make sure that we know where that ego is, and that we're trying to be as in control of it as possible. As we sort of wind down over here, I just have two rapid fire questions over here. Just curious if there is either a book or a podcast or YouTube talk that you would recommend to people that want to know more about adoption or want to know more about this concept of hypnosis from a beginner's perspective. Where would you recommend? Where would you send people to?
For adoption, I highly recommend simply Googling the Center for Adoption Support and Education, CASE, very much known by its acronym. That has a wealth of information regarding adoption resources and best practices. So that, at least for adoption, that's a website I highly recommend exploring and looking into. If you're somebody that is interested in adopting, is adopted, or a birth parent, there's also, they offer, a list of adoption competent therapists, as well as support groups and other resources. So I think that's a very helpful resource.
What would be one question that you wish was asked more in the adoption world, specifically from the kids' perspective, on how they would talk to their parents?
For kids, what tends to come up, with them is, man, I don't want to hurt mom and dad's feelings. Like, but I really, really want to learn more about where I come from. What do I do? I think that a lot of times comes up for kids. They're really afraid to bring up things with their parents. And so I think validating that for the kids is really important. You don't want to hurt your parents, but there does need to be that, and I think this is incredibly important for parents to know, there needs to be that, that open communication and empathy with the kids, so that, kids can feel more secure with asking those important questions.
For sure. Is there any book or recommendation you might have for someone looking to try out hypnosis for the first time?
Offhand, I know the American School of Hypnosis has a free manual that they recommend, that they have written with, I mean to say, and it is actually a really good place to start. I don't know what the manual is called, but it's basically just go on the American School of Hypnosis' website. You'll find it.
Amazing. Okay. Here, if you can think of specifically for you, Gayle, a mundane, everyday superpower that you can have to help out with your parenting, what would that be?
Oh, wow. A superpower, I would say the ability to, if I could press a button to remind myself at all times that to just take a breath before responding, I think that would be an enormous help for me. I have to do that. Yeah. I have to be the one to remind myself. But if I could push a button, that'd be awesome. I'd love that.
For sure. Okay, so where can people find more information about you, and how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, the best place to get in touch with me and find out more is by going on my website. That's my first name, last name, LCSW, as in licensed clinical social worker.com. So Gayle Weill, LCSW.com.
That's GAYLEWEILLLCSW. So that's two L's, CSW.com. And we'll try to have a link for that in our show notes over here. Gayle, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for all the wisdom that you shared with us today.
Thank you, Hananya. I really appreciate